December 24th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen landscape, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. In a hastily constructed prisoner war compound near the town of Bastogne, 342 German soldiers sat huddled beneath canvas tops stretched between wooden posts. Their breath rose in white plumes. Their hands, red and cracked from cold, clutched threadbare blankets that did little against the bitter wind. Some were barely 20 years old. Others were veterans of the Eastern Front, their eyes hollowed by what they had seen. All of them were hungry. All of them were exhausted. And all of them believed they were about to die. The compound was ringed by barbed wire and guarded by American soldiers of the 28th Infantry Division, men who had fought their way across France, who had liberated villages and cities, who had seen their brothers cut down by German machine guns and artillery. These Americans had every reason to hate, every reason to seek revenge. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter offensive, had begun just 8 days earlier. American casualties were mounting. The cold was merciless. Supplies were running low. And here, behind the wire, sat the enemy. But on this night, this Christmas Eve, something happened that defied the logic of war. From the American camp came a sound. Not the bark of orders or the crack of gunfire, but singing, voices raised in harmony, carrying across the frozen ground. Silent night. The melody was unmistakable, even to those who did not speak English. And then, from within the prisoner compound, hesitant at first, came answering voices, still knacked. The same song, the same melody, in a different tongue. A German guard named Hauptmann Ernst Weber stood at the wire, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. He had been captured 3 days earlier, along with his men, during the chaos of the American counterattack. He had expected execution. He had been told, repeatedly, by his superiors that the Americans took no prisoners, that they shot German officers on sight, that surrender meant torture and death. But instead, he had been given water, rations, a blanket, and now, on Christmas Eve, he watched as American soldiers approached the wire carrying something he could not quite comprehend. Food, real food, not the thin gruel or moldy bread that had sustained the Wehrmacht for months, but actual meals, canned ham, potatoes, coffee, real coffee, steaming and dark, chocolate bars, and bread, fresh white bread, still warm, carried in wooden crates by men who should have been enemies but who moved with an ease and casualness that suggested something else entirely. Weber's throat tightened. His hands began to tremble. He had fought in Poland, in France, in Russia, where he had seen things that had carved away pieces of his soul. He had believed in the Reich, believed in the cause, believed that Germany was fighting for survival against a world of inferiors and degenerates. He had been told that Americans were weak, corrupted by luxury and racial mixing, incapable of real sacrifice. But as he watched those soldiers distribute food to their captives, as he watched them smile, gesture, attempt broken German phrases while handing plates through the wire, something inside him cracked. He could not speak. None of the German guards could. They simply stood and watched, silenced by the incomprehensible generosity of men they had been taught to despise. To understand the magnitude of what occurred that night, one must first understand the world from which these German soldiers came. By December 1944, Nazi Germany was a nation devouring itself. The war had consumed everything: resources, infrastructure, hope. Cities lay in ruins beneath Allied bombing campaigns. The Eastern Front was collapsing as Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward. Supply lines had fractured. The vaunted Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine in Europe, was now composed largely of old men, boys, and the remnants of battered divisions held together by discipline and desperation. Hunger had become the Reich's constant companion. Rations had been cut again and again. What the German soldiers ate bore little resemblance to food: sawdust mixed with flour for bread, ersatz coffee brewed from acorns and chicory, meat that was often horse meat or worse. In the final months of 1944, frontline troops sometimes went days without hot meals. They scrounged from abandoned villages, foraged in forests, stole from each other. The Nazi regime, which had promised abundance and glory, had delivered only scarcity and suffering. And yet the propaganda persisted. Even as the Reich crumbled, Joseph Goebbels' ministry continued to pump out messages insisting that final victory was inevitable, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that Germany's enemies were on the verge of collapse. The Americans, the propaganda claimed, were facing starvation. Their economy was in shambles. Their society, weakened by democracy and diversity, was tearing itself apart. The German soldiers believed this because they needed to believe it, because the alternative, that they had sacrificed everything for a lie, was too terrible to contemplate. But then came capture, and with capture came revelation. The first shock for most German prisoners was simple. They were not shot, despite everything they had been told. Despite the terror that gripped them as they raised their hands in surrender, the Americans did not execute them. They were searched, disarmed, and marched to holding areas. They were given water, sometimes food, sometimes medical attention. The treatment was not luxurious. It was war, after all, and resources were strained. But it was humane. It followed the rules laid out in the Geneva Convention, rules that the riot itself had largely abandoned. The second shock was subtler but more profound. It was a realization, dawning slowly, that their captors were not starving, were not weak, were not collapsing. The American soldiers who guarded them were well-fed, well-equipped, and astonishingly casual in their confidence. They had cigarettes to spare. They had candy bars they gave away without thought. They had trucks and jeeps and weapons and ammunition in quantities that seemed impossible. And they had food. So much food. Gefreiter Hans Kessler, a rifleman from Munich captured near Luxembourg, later wrote in his diary, "I could not believe what I saw. The Americans ate from cans, meat, vegetables, fruit, all in cans. They had white bread. They had butter. They complained about the coffee, said it was terrible, but to us it was luxury beyond measure. I began to understand that we had been lied to about everything." The decision to share Christmas dinner with the prisoners was not made at the highest levels of command. It did not come from Supreme Headquarters or from the generals planning the next offensive. It came from men, ordinary soldiers who, despite the horror and violence they had experienced, retained a stubborn humanity that refused to be extinguished. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Bradford, a battalion commander from Virginia, had been raised in a family that took Christmas seriously. His father had been a minister. The values of charity, forgiveness, and Christian mercy had been drilled into him since childhood. When he surveyed his prisoner compound on December 23rd and saw the condition of the captured Germans, shivering, starving, some injured, he was struck by a simple thought. These men were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, and it was Christmas. He called together his senior sergeants. "We've got extra rations," he said. "The supply drop yesterday was generous. What do you say we share some with the prisoners? It's Christmas Eve tomorrow." There was silence. Then Sergeant Michael O'Rourke, a tough Irishman from Boston who had lost friends in the fighting, spoke up. "Say, these bastards have been killing us for weeks. Some of the boys might not take kindly to feeding them." Bradford nodded. "I know, but we're not them. We're Americans. We don't starve prisoners. We don't treat men like animals. If we do that, what the hell are we fighting for?" Another sergeant, Joseph Martinez from Texas, added quietly, "My abuela always said you can tell the measure of a man by how he treats those who can't fight back. These Germans can't fight us now. They're at our mercy. Seems to me that's when mercy matters most." The decision was made, not because it was easy, but because it was right, because the men of the 28th Infantry Division understood, perhaps only instinctively, that how they treated their enemies said something fundamental about what kind of nation they represented. On the afternoon of December 24th, the cooks began preparing. They opened cans of ham and potatoes. They brewed enormous pots of coffee. They baked bread using field ovens, simple, white loaves that filled the cold air with a smell that was almost painful in its homeliness. Some soldiers donated their own ration chocolate. Others contributed canned fruit. A chaplain produced a small evergreen branch, which was fashioned into a crude Christmas decoration and placed at the entrance to the prisoner compound. As the evening fell and darkness settled over the forest, the American soldiers began carrying the food to the wire. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just men handing plates and cups through the fence to other men who stared back with expressions of disbelief. Private Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from California, later recalled, "They looked at us like we were ghosts, like they couldn't process what was happening." One of them started crying, just stood there with a plate of food in his hands, tears running down his face. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded at him. He nodded back. The food itself became a kind of language, a communication more powerful than word could achieve. Each item told a story that contradicted everything the German soldiers had been taught to believe about America. The bread, first of all, white, soft, made from refined flour. It was the antithesis of the dense, dark, gritty loaves that had become standard in Germany. To the prisoners, this bread was not merely food. It was evidence of agricultural abundance, of functioning supply chains, of an industrial capacity that could afford to mill flour finely and transport fresh bread to the front lines. In the Reich, such bread had become a memory reserved for the elite. Hey, it was given to prisoners. The canned ham was equally revealing. Meat, real meat, not the mysterious sausages or the thin stews that constituted German rations, preserved in tin cans that bore labels promising quality and nutrition. The prisoners examined these cans with fascination. Some kept them, unable to quite believe they were real. The fact that America could afford to can meat, to transport it across an ocean, to distribute it to frontline troops and even to prisoners, spoke to an economic power that rendered Nazi propaganda absurd. And then there was the coffee. To Americans, coffee was commonplace, unremarkable, a daily necessity often taken for granted. But to the German soldiers, who had subsisted on chicory and roasted grain for years, real coffee was a revelation. The smell alone was intoxicating. The taste, bitter, strong, hot, was almost overwhelming. Some of the prisoners drank it slowly, savoring every sip, trying to make it last. Others gulped it down quickly, as if afraid it would vanish. Obergefreiter Friedrich Zimmermann, a veteran of Stalingrad who had survived the encirclement and somehow made it back to German lines, sat with his tin cup of coffee cradled in both hands. He stared into the dark liquid as if it contained answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. He had believed, once, that the Soviet Union's defeat was inevitable, that the Reich would prevail through superior will and organization. He had watched those beliefs die in the frozen hell of the Volga. And now, here in Belgium, holding American coffee, he felt the last remnants of his faith in the Nazi project crumble away. "They have everything," he murmured to the man beside him, "and they give it away. To us, to their enemies. What kind of people do that?" The man, a younger soldier named Peter, replied softly, "Free people. I think that's what free people do." Historical documentation of prisoner of war treatment reveals a stark contrast between the approaches of different nations during World War II. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established international standards for the humane treatment of prisoners, including provisions for adequate food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence and humiliation. The United States, Great Britain, and most Western democracies adhered to these standards with varying degrees of strictness. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, by contrast, viewed the convention as optional at best and irrelevant at worst. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was genocidal. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht, roughly 3.3 million died in captivity, killed by starvation, exposure, disease, or outright execution. This was not accidental. It was policy, rooted in Nazi racial ideology that deemed Slavic people subhuman. Soviet prisoners were worked to death in labor camps, left to freeze in open pens, denied medical care, and fed starvation rations deliberately calculated to kill. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was similarly brutal, though driven more by cultural contempt for surrender than by racial ideology. The Bataan Death March, the construction of the Burma Railway, the countless atrocities in prison camps across the Pacific, all testified to a system that viewed captured soldiers as shameful cowards unworthy of basic human dignity. Against this backdrop, American treatment of Axis prisoners stands in sharp relief. By war's end, the United States held over 425,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps across the continental United States, as well as hundreds of thousands more in camps in Europe and North Africa. The mortality rate among these prisoners was less than 1%, lower, in fact, than the mortality rate among American soldiers in non-combat roles. Prisoners were housed in barracks, fed 3 meals a day, given medical care, allowed to work for wages, and permitted to receive mail and Red Cross packages. Many gained weight in captivity. Some described their treatment as the best period of their lives. This was not altruism divorced from self-interest. American policymakers understood that humane treatment of prisoners served multiple purposes. It encouraged surrender, reducing casualties on both sides. It provided leverage in negotiations for the treatment of American prisoners held by the enemy. It offered opportunities for intelligence gathering, as well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced the ideological message at the heart of the war, that democracy, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, produced a more just and humane society than totalitarianism ever could. But beyond policy calculations, there was something else at work, something cultural and deeply American. The United States was a nation built on immigration, on the idea that people from different backgrounds could come together and forge a new identity. Many American soldiers were themselves the children or grandchildren of German immigrants. They spoke German, or their parents did. They had relatives in Germany, or remembered stories of the old country. This created a psychological complexity that Nazi ideology, with its rigid classifications of us versus them, could not accommodate. The Americans could hate Hitler and love German music. They could despise the Wehrmacht and feel pity for the 19-year-old conscript shivering in a foxhole. They could fight ferociously and still offer a cigarette to a surrendering enemy. This cognitive flexibility, this ability to separate the regime from the individual, the ideology from the human being, was a product of democratic culture. And it was on full display in that prisoner compound on Christmas Eve, 1944. As the evening progressed, the singing grew louder. The barriers between captors and captives began to blur, not in terms of security or discipline, but in terms of shared humanity. American soldiers stood at the wire, humming along to German carols. German prisoners attempted English Christmas songs, mangling the pronunciation but getting the melodies right. Laughter echoed across the compound, tentative at first, then more freely. Hauptmann Weber, the officer who had stood silent and trembling when the food first arrived, found himself in conversation with Lieutenant Bradford. Weber's English was passable, learned in university before the war. Bradford's German was almost non-existent, but they managed. Why? Weber asked simply, gesturing at the food, the singing, the impossible scene around them. Why do you do this? We are your enemies. Bradford considered the question. He could have given a political answer, something about American values or democratic principles. Instead, he said, because it's Christmas, and because you're men. That's enough. Weber shook his head slowly. I was told you would torture us, that you would kill us. I believed it. We're not like that, Bradford replied. We're fighting a war, not waging genocide. There's a difference. Is there? Weber's voice was bitter. I have seen what war does. In Russia, in Poland, the things we did, the things I saw. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to continue. Bradford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yeah, there's a difference. You can fight to win without becoming a monster. That's what we're trying to prove. That democracy isn't weakness. That treating people decently isn't the same as being soft. We're just as tough as you are. But we don't have to be cruel to be strong. Weber looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Pain, recognition, shame, relief, all mixed together. I think, he said slowly, that I have been very wrong about many things. The bread, that simple, white, warm bread, became the symbol that the prisoners carried with them, not just through the rest of their captivity, but for the rest of their lives. In their letters home, in their memoirs written decades later, in interviews conducted by historians, they returned again and again to the bread. It represented everything they had been denied, everything they had been lied to about. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a machine gunner from Hamburg, later wrote, The bread was more than food. It was proof that we had been deceived. We were told America was starving, that their society was collapsing, that they were desperate and weak. But they had bread. Fresh bread, and they gave it to us. I cannot overstate what that meant. It was as if the entire foundation of what I believed had been built on sand, and now the tide was coming in. This symbolism was not lost on the American soldiers either. Many of them came from backgrounds where bread had profound cultural and religious significance. For Catholics and Protestants alike, bread was the body of Christ, the symbol of divine provision and community. To share bread was to acknowledge kinship, to extend the hand of fellowship. The act of giving bread to the enemy was thus both practical and deeply symbolic, a statement that even in war, some bonds transcended national boundaries. The bread appeared in other forms too. Some prisoners saved small pieces, wrapping them carefully and keeping them in their pockets like talismans. A few attempted to barter for more, offering watches or medals in exchange, only to be told by amused American soldiers that there was no need. There was plenty. This abundance, this casual generosity, reinforced a message. America was not a society on the brink of collapse. It was thriving, and that prosperity was not hoarded by elites but distributed widely, even to enemies. In the weeks that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge ground on and the German offensive finally collapsed, more prisoners flowed into Allied hands. Word spread among them about the treatment they could expect. Stories of the Christmas meal circulated, gaining embellishment with each retelling but maintaining their essential truth. The Americans shared their food. They gave bread to the hungry. They treated prisoners like human beings. This had a measurable effect on German morale and willingness to surrender. Intelligence reports from early 1945 noted an increase in desertions and surrenders, particularly among units facing American forces as opposed to Soviet forces. The Red Army, with justifiable rage after years of German atrocities on Soviet soil, offered no mercy. Captured German soldiers faced almost certain death or years in brutal labor camps. The Americans offered food, shelter, and life. Given the choice, many German soldiers chose to flee west toward the Americans and British, rather than east toward the Soviets. This was psychological warfare of a different kind, not through intimidation or terror, but through demonstration. The United States did not need to announce its superiority through propaganda. It simply needed to be itself, to act according to its values, and the contrast with Nazi Germany spoke volumes. The epilogue of that Christmas Eve extended far beyond the immediate moment, rippling outward through time and memory. Many of the German prisoners held by the Americans were eventually repatriated to Germany after the war. They returned to a country devastated, divided, occupied, and forced to confront the full horror of what the Nazi regime had done. The process of denazification was painful and incomplete, but it was necessary. Germany had to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. And in that rebuilding, the men who had experienced American captivity played a significant role. They had seen firsthand an alternative way of organizing society. They had witnessed prosperity built on freedom rather than conquest. They had experienced the practical application of democratic values, due process, humane treatment, respect for individual dignity. These were not abstract concepts, but lived realities. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, the officer who had wept at the wire, returned to Germany in 1946. He settled in West Germany, in the American occupation zone, and became a teacher. He taught history, carefully, honestly, helping a new generation understand how Germany had gone so terribly wrong. In his classroom, he kept a photograph of that prisoner compound in Belgium. He never forgot what he had seen there. Friedrich Zimmermann, the Stalingrad veteran, immigrated to the United States in 1951. He settled in Wisconsin, worked in a factory, raised a family, and became an American citizen. When asked, years later, why he had chosen to leave Germany, he said simply, "I wanted to live in a country where there's always bread." Klaus Richter, the machine gunner from Hamburg, became a journalist. He wrote extensively about the war, about German guilt, about the necessity of confronting the past. And in nearly everything he wrote, there was a reference to abundance versus scarcity, generosity versus hoarding, the open hand versus the closed fist. These men were not exceptional. They were representative of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of German soldiers whose encounters with American troops and American values planted seeds of transformation. Not all of those seeds took root. Some men returned to Germany hardened, embittered, unwilling or unable to change. But many did change, and their influence, multiplied across families and communities, contributed to the remarkable rebirth of Germany as a democratic, prosperous nation allied with its former enemies. The broader lesson of that Christmas meal, the lesson that transcended the specific time and place, was about the nature of power. The Nazi regime had understood power as domination, as the ability to impose will through force, to extract obedience through fear, to organize society through hierarchy and violence. This was power conceived narrowly, as a zero-sum game where one's gain required another's loss. American power, at its best, operated on a different principle. It was power conceived as capacity, the capacity to produce, to innovate, to include, to share. It was power that grew not by taking from others but by creating abundance. And crucially, it was power that retained moral legitimacy by remaining tethered to principles of justice and human dignity. This distinction was not merely theoretical. It had practical consequences. A society organized around domination and scarcity had to maintain constant vigilance against internal dissent and external threats. It had to invest enormous resources in surveillance and repression. It had to restrict information, control movement, crush independent thought. All of this was costly, inefficient, and ultimately unsustainable. A society organized around freedom and abundance, by contrast, could afford to be open. It could tolerate dissent because it was confident in its foundations. It could share resources because it trusted in its capacity to generate more. It could treat enemies humanely because it did not fear that mercy would be mistaken for weakness. This was a lesson that the German prisoners learned, not through lectures or propaganda, but through experience. They learned it in the taste of fresh bread. They learned it in the warmth of hot coffee. They learned it in the incomprehensible act of American soldiers singing Christmas carols with their captives. They learned it in the simple, undeniable fact that a free society had beaten a totalitarian one not just militarily, but morally and economically. And this lesson, once learned, could not be unlearned. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, the singing eventually faded. The prisoners returned to their shelters, bellies fuller than they had been in months, minds churning with thoughts and questions they had never before allowed themselves to consider. The American guards resumed their posts, checking perimeters, maintaining vigilance, but doing so with a quiet satisfaction that came from having done something right in a world full of wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford stood alone for a moment, watching the camp settle into sleep. He thought about his father, the minister, who had taught him that faith without works was dead, that belief meant nothing without action. He thought about his wife and children back in Virginia, about the world he was fighting to preserve and pass on to them. He thought about the German soldiers behind the wire, young men whose lives had been twisted by ideology and propaganda, but who were, underneath it all, not so different from himself. He did not know if what they had done tonight would matter in the grand scheme of the war. He did not know if any of those prisoners would remember, or if the memory would change them. He only knew that it had been the right thing to do, that in a war full of necessary evils, they had managed to commit one small, unnecessary good. And somehow, that felt like a victory worth having. The war would continue for 4 more months. The Battle of the Bulge would end in a decisive Allied victory, the last major German offensive crushed by American resilience and firepower. The Red Army would push into Germany from the east, liberating concentration camps and revealing the full extent of Nazi horror. American and British forces would cross the Rhine, fight their way through the heart of Germany, and finally, in May 1945, accept unconditional surrender. The prisoners in that compound would witness Germany's defeat, some from captivity, others after being repatriated in prisoner exchanges. They would see their homeland occupied, divided, their cities reduced to rubble, their people confronting unimaginable guilt and shame. They would live through the hardest years of Reconstruction, when food was scarce again, when every day was a struggle, when the future seemed impossibly bleak. But many of them would remember that Christmas Eve. They would remember the bread, the coffee, the singing. They would remember that at their lowest moment, when they had nothing, when they were at the mercy of enemies who had every right to hate them, those enemies had chosen kindness instead. And that memory would sustain them. It would give them hope that even after terrible evil, redemption was possible. That even after the worst crimes, humanity could reassert itself. That the world was not irredeemably dark, that there were still people and principles worth believing in. This was the true victory of that Christmas meal. Not that it ended the war or changed its outcome. It did neither. But it preserved the idea that war need not consume everything, that even in violence there could be limits, that the light of human decency could persist in the darkest times. The bread they shared that night became a seed of doubt in totalitarian certainty, a seed of hope in democratic possibility, a seed of recognition that abundance and freedom were not weaknesses but strengths, not corruptions or foundations of a better world. Some of those seeds fell on rocky ground and withered, but others took root. They grew slowly, quietly, shaping minds and hearts in ways that could not be measured by battles won or territory gained. They grew into the post-war order, into the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, into the democratic institutions that replaced fascist regimes, into the alliance between former enemies that has kept the peace in Europe for nearly 8 decades. And they grew in individual lives, in the choices made by men like Weber, Zimmermann, and Richter, and thousands of others like them. Men who had been soldiers of a monstrous regime but who became citizens of free societies, who raised their children to value democracy, who taught their students to question authority, who built lives based on the principle that there is always enough when people choose to share. The final truth of that Christmas Eve in 1944 is this: freedom is not merely the absence of oppression. It is the presence of grace. It is a capacity to extend mercy when revenge would be easier, to share when hoarding would be safer, to see the humanity in an enemy when dehumanization would be more comfortable. This capacity does not come naturally. It must be cultivated, defended, renewed in each generation. It requires institutions that protect individual rights and democratic processes that distribute power. But most of all, it requires individuals who choose, in specific moments, to act according to higher principles rather than base impulses. The American soldiers who shared their Christmas dinner with German prisoners made such a choice. They did not do it for glory or recognition. Many of their names are being lost to history. They did it because it was right, because their understanding of what America meant, what it should mean, demanded it. And in doing so, they won a victory more lasting than any battle. They proved that the values their nation claimed to represent were real. That democracy was not just a political system, but a moral commitment. That abundance shared was more powerful than scarcity hoarded. That a society built on freedom could be both strong and good. The German prisoners who witnessed this would carry that proof with them for the rest of their lives. In their memories, in their actions, in the stories they told, the message would persist: there's another way, a way where power serves justice rather than oppressing it, where prosperity lifts all rather than enriching a few, where even enemies can be treated with dignity because human dignity is recognized as universal and inviolable. This is a legacy of that single night in December 1944. Not a grand turning point in the war, but a quiet moment of transformation. Not a victory measured in miles gained or enemies defeated, but a victory of principle over expedience, of humanity over hatred, of hope over despair. The bread is long gone, consumed and digested, its physical substance returned to the earth. But what it represented, abundance, generosity, the possibility of grace even in the midst of horror, remains. It lives in the rebuilt cities of Germany, in the democratic institutions of Europe, in the alliance between nations that were once mortal enemies. And it lives in the memory of men, long dead now, who once sat in a frozen compound on Christmas Eve and learned that the enemy was not what they had been told, that freedom was not weakness, that there could be, even in war, such a thing as enough, such a thing as mercy, such a thing as hope. The gods were silenced that night not because they had nothing to say, but because words were inadequate. They stood at the wire and witnessed something that contradicted everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything their Redeemer had promised. They witnessed generosity from those who had no obligation to give. They witnessed humanity from those who had every right to hate. And in their silence, something shifted. A crack appeared in the foundation of totalitarian certainty. Light entered where before there had been only darkness. That light, once admitted, could never be entirely extinguished that IT burned still.